Wilfried Bolewski was a previous diplomat for the German government, a civil servant, serving in Italy, Poland, Australia, Cameroon, Pakistan, and so forth. I'm not going to name all the countries. Ambassador Bolewski served as Deputy Chief of Protocol for the Chancellors Gerhard Schröder and Angela Merkel, and as German Foreign Office Special Representative for Universities and Foundations at the Foreign Service Academy Berlin. He was also intimately involved from the German government side with NATO. Ambassador Bolewski has more recently pursued an academic career, teaching diplomacy at the faculties of law and political science at the Freie Universität Berlin, and as senior fellow at the Hertie School of Governance, also in Berlin. Since 2008, he has taught at Sciences Po, Paris, and is now teaching at the American University of Paris, and we are delighted to have him. Professor Bolewski has published widely in German, English, and French on international law, diplomacy, and protocol. He continues to work on the interface of diplomacy and civil society in a globalizing world. I have the particular pleasure of introducing him because I'm also auditing his class this semester on diplomacy and crisis, and I'm very, very interested in what he's doing. Which is really, at least from my side, but he's going to tell us much more himself and his perspective, focusing on ethical, legal, and political potential and limits in the 21st century. Now, if I'm not mistaken, tonight's paper pursues these problems with regard to the difficult issue of regime change, and the paper is called Engaging Diplomacy and Ethics for Creative Crisis Management. Professor Bolewski, it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the kind words of introduction. Thank you for your time. I know your time is precious, much more precious than mine, so I appreciate it giving to me, and I hope I can fill it with some provocative thoughts and ideas. Let me start off with an assessment which could not be more non-ideological and neutral in its analysis by the Global Risks 2012, Global Risks 2012 assessment of the World Economic Forum, which starts tonight, actually with a speech with Merkel. This assessment I find very interesting because it asks the question, what risks should the world leaders be addressing over the next 10 years? It would be good to know, because these will be the topics that you will be working on in one way or another. And this analysis points out three, all around the global heading of governance failure in a hyper-connected world. It's already an admission, I think a very realistic admission. The three pillars of this governance failure are enunciated as follows. The first one is seeds of dystopia. Don't worry, I had to look it up as well. An imaginary place and society in which everything is bad, the counter of utopia. Globalization is not delivering on its promises. And in consequence, there is, according to the analysis, a loss of confidence. Confidence in the decision makers to tackle today's problems. Disparities in wealth, feeling of disengagement, discontent, social contracts are breaking down, sluggish global growth risk disappointing the expectations. Key word, expectations. I'll come back to it. The second point they are making is the question, how safe are our safeguards? Obviously, the safeguards we have, called regulations in general, or regimes more particularly, are not in sync with the demands of problem solving in today's world. And the third pillar is, before I come to the third, they already indicate here that all this has to be approached in a mindset change which is needed. A mindset change is needed. Albert Einstein Einstein once said, "You cannot solve problems with the same mindset that created them." How true. The third pillar then is the internet. We all know unsolved problems of regulation between the three pillars of the technical side of the internet, of business involved in internet and state, as well as the civil society as users of the internet. Open problems from pornography to mega upload as we are seeing it now, copyrights and international security. I'm just touching upon those to clarify the problems as they are seen here. What should be done, according to the analysis? Traditional solutions are misapplied to novel problems. The structural changes require a different sort of solutions. And we should start the necessary conversation, meaning an international discourse has to be opened on the solution of these problems. And this discourse, I think, and here I take already on my conclusions, should be ethically norm-based pragmatism or value-based common sense. I'll explain. I think we can pretty much all agree on this analysis, especially on the internet one as a global commons. I would like to come back if we have time later on. But I would now like to answer in parts the question, what can diplomacy do to solve these problems? Not in a specific way, but in a structural and procedural way. And for that, I think we have to turn our minds to what is known strategic moral diplomacy. What is strategic moral diplomacy? One of the key understandings is a variety of conflicting moral claims can be reasonably justified by different ethical norms. Not only one claim, all claims can be ethically justified. A matter of discourse, a matter of discoursive communication. They are both context and personality driven. I've ventured into the personality, especially lately. Particular norms are salient to particular actors for a variety of reasons, including social and cognitive, psychological reasons, moral concerns, and other self-interest. The important point here is that the claims of the other should be recognized. As much as you put forward the claim of your own interest, it is much more important to succeed with your own claim to know the other claim. The prescription, therefore, is acknowledge the enemies, let's say moderately, the other moral universe within strategic parameters in order to reach strategic goals. Regard the others and her grievances. Brzezinski's newest book, Strategic Vision. Well, tough luck. If he has a strategic vision for the American society, it's fine. But it is not as relevant as to have a strategic vision of the other and their claims and their grievances. I hope it's in the book. I haven't read it yet. It's coming out today. But in any case, the approach should be to effectively grant the other a space from which he or she can speak to the moral universe. Sounds outrageous if you put this into connection with Al-Qaeda or others. We'll come to it. So the first requirement is then to acknowledge the other in a strategic moral diplomacy. Now a word of the famous self-interest. This recognition of the other is very often limited by the idea of self-interest. Here I am, a representative, to defend the interest of my country, my interest, my company, whatever. Self-interest. Self-interest and ethical concerns are not mutually exclusive. They have to be somehow harmonized. You can only defend your self-interest if you put it into context of the other, of the community interest. It sounds contradictory. It is not. It is what actually comes out as an enlightened self-interest. The persuasiveness of your self-interest lies in making it acceptable, if not attractive, but at least acceptable to the other. So much for the self-interest and ethics. Self-interest is always includes moral justification and consideration. And wisely, you should give not credence, but at least a certain basis of awareness to the other moral justification as much as you expect the recognition of your own moral justification. As I have said in the beginning, there are many ways of moral justification of causes. And there is not one right way, one wrong way, or there is not one that excludes the other. You have to look at it in a certain extensive and broadened way. Therefore, I give a cursory summary of my first idea is there's a need for reframing of moral points of conflict in order to reach strategic objectives. It needs eventually a harmonization of opposing norms and of opposing interests. Some call it communitarianism, some call it cosmopolitanism. The wording is yours. Now, if strategic moral diplomacy is seeking to understand the enemy's, the other's moral universe, it's invaluable as a means of identifying points of disagreement that should be rigorously addressed by for a stable peace. But not only the point of disagreement, through the points of disagreement, you will finally come to the points of agreement. It's a matter of search and a matter of insistence. The moral action does not exist frozen in space and time exclusively of personality, historical context, and power relationship that define morality for individuals. Let me move from the point of the other to a look into a few definitional understandings. There is an understanding, and I can share this, of not only moral strategic diplomacy, but what is called the full spectrum diplomacy. In other words, in order to practice diplomacy, you have to go through the whole range of means, procedures, tools of diplomacy. I open a parenthesis for those who listen to this area for the first time. Foreign policy are the strategic decisions and points of practical policy. Diplomacy is just, if I may say so, the procedure to realize them. Very often confused. Kissinger's diplomacy. No, Kissinger hasn't invented diplomacy. Kissinger has made foreign policy statements and has interests defended in a strategic way. Diplomacy is just the procedure to realize them. Anyhow, full spectrum diplomacy, combination of traditional government to government diplomacy with the many components of public diplomacy. You have heard about soft and hard power with culture included, as well as the integration of these two functions with other instruments of statecraft. Hidden under these words is military power. Statecraft is made of peaceful means, diplomacy, and of not so peaceful military means, use of power, all together called statecraft. It needs an orchestration of these peaceful as well as military means. And that's what comes to the fore more and more in our times. You can call this a grand strategy, or I think more conveniently a full spectrum diplomacy. word by a philosopher a bit far away, Sun Tzu, who just said, to defeat the enemy without the use of armed force is the pinnacle of excellence. In other words, that's his definition of diplomacy. It is much more convenient to use all the other 95% of instruments of peaceful problem solving than the remaining 5% of military intervention. We know, don't we? Then there are the various forms of diplomacy, dialogue and engagement. Certainly engagement is the one that's important. There is the integration of diplomatic work with the instruments of hard power. The mixture makes the possibility to work in all ways. In order to understand all the arts, all of the arts and statecraft of diplomacy, you need a knowledge, a sound knowledge of the procedures of diplomacy. They are best involved in the UN Charter, and they are known to you maybe in ways of one-track and two-track diplomacy in terms of the conference diplomacy or diplomacy through negotiations. A word on sanctions, very much in the present usage, because they are publicly, they have a great public appeal, also as means of diplomatic targeting and diplomatic tools, including economic sanctions. Sanctions must be targeted against the so-called enemy and not the rest of the population, not the innocent population. Very often sanctions fail because they are not exactly concentrated on those that should be affected. There are at least three notions why sanctions in most of the cases as a means of diplomacy do not work. One is international solidarity. Difficult to find. Just keep in mind Iran presently. The second one, no loopholes. It only works if there are no loopholes. If you have a Dubai or others, it can't be watertight. And it needs the public branding of spoilers. I'm concentrate on the first two as the main reasons why sanctions most of the time cannot and will not work. The lack of international solidarity and the fact that there are always loopholes. So much to sanctions. Now, I know as a government representative I had to defend sanctions as they are progressing nowadays against Iran, for example. More sanctions, and there is a ray of hope that maybe it will have the wanted effect. I think it's the wrong way to go. It's not in more, but in other, new, creative thinking that you have to approach the problem. And I'll give you elements of answers later on. You mentioned the element of regime change. With sanctions is very often combined the idea of regime change. It creates great tension to the one that you address this idea of regime change to. It has negative connotations. It provides the element of fear. Every government confronted with the idea and the intention of regime change will block out a fear of survival. You somehow have to remove the threat of regime change overthrow, the notion that all sanctions are basically meant to provide a regime change. Because against this fear, you only have an escalation of reaction. But if you play the card of regime change, I think you're already initially off to a bad start. I'd rather take away the notion of overthrow, and certainly the overthrow should not be the immediate aim. What you should aim with sanctions in this direction is a peaceful transition, which would take away. More difficult to do than it is said. The aim is, when I talk about peaceful transition, a policy change, not a regime change. So one should, by all means, focus on the fact of policy change and not the outright regime change. If this regime would not be there, if we only had another regime, things would turn out better. Wrong approach. You have the regime and those supporters, and the regime will muster the support around itself against you. Right, regime change. Advocating a policy of regime change will almost surely thwart the possibilities for diplomatic engagement. If you claim to engage and you start off with regime change, I think you're off to a wrong track. Live and let live world of political difference is critical to the success of any sort of engagement. Underlying this sort of engagement is the mutual recognition. You can't do without it. You cannot bedevil the other side forever, more and more, but rather to engage via a mutual recognition, which demands a minimum of recognition. It may be hard, after having bedeviled the enemy for a long time, to return to this idea, but there's no other way around it. At least this, I suggest, is the hope for a new approach. I'll make some remarks on another topic, which is talking with terrorists. I have my idea on it, and here it is. The main aim dealing with terrorists, actually with any opponent, peaceful or as in terrorist terms non-peaceful, is to find out their grievances. Their grievances are mostly based on social, ethnic, religious expectation, which have not been fulfilled in the past. And this is why they are out of the lack of fulfillment and the outlook of no way out. This is why they very often then resort to terrorist action. But tracing back terrorism always leads you to the social, ethnic, human grievances. And these are the ones to take into consideration. Not that I promote the act of terrorism. I'm just giving you one idea is behind the act, the terrible act of terrorism is unfulfilled social demands. I'm not saying that all these demands should be fulfilled. No, I'm saying they should be analyzed. But very often, the cry out of war on terror or immediate action, running into the military action first before thinking, analyzing, is already covering up the possibility of ever gaining an insight into the concerns and grievances of the terrorists or their supporters. Next point. If you can't get hold of the terrorists, obviously, you have to look into the field of supporters. If you, for argument's sake, once leave out the terrorists and their aims and concerns and their grievances, look into the grievances of the supporters. Because if you win them over, the terrorists will lose their support. And that's one way of changing the scenery. In other words, influencing the environment around the core of terrorists and the supporter level and their basis. It is always worthwhile looking into their grievances, which hasn't been done in the beginning, in no case, unfortunately, and it's difficult to roll back to these grievances now, because we're already much too advanced in the adversarial thinking and in the action and into the military progress. Difficult, but it's worthwhile, should be done. Okay, I think I'll leave this one for a moment and come to an idea which I consider to be the role of change in international relations. And especially the role of international law, in as much as it is highly moralized and ethically bound, the role of international law in this field of events that have a disruptive nature of change with global impact. These situations are ever occurring and are part of international relations. So change in itself is part of international relations. Only the UN Charter once had the idea of manifesting and putting into stone a certain situation called the post-World War scenario and situation. And but even as I have explained elsewhere, the UN Charter has elements of change in it. And even if it would not, the reality of international relations change is a ongoing event. In such a situation of change, as a civil servant and as decision makers, you need to take a decision. You have to move from reflection to action. That's the difference between a decision maker and an academic. As a result of legal argument, moral political persuasion, discursive analysis at best, and communicative action. How do you go about it in taking a decision? It is done by a reduction of an event into a pattern. You're trying to find a pattern for the event. History will help you. History might guide you to a certain degree, but it's not all, because all events are different in history, in the historic terms, and you have to look for the newness of an event, more so than the similarity to events in the past. Somehow you try to reduce an event into a pattern, rule, principle, custom, look for precedents. But sooner or later, you will have to think outside the box. You have to find the innovative approach. You have to look at the singularity of the event. What is new? What's the change for? Where does the change head for? In order to capture the reality and the elements of change. To capture reality and thereby the singularity, individuality, the uniqueness of the situation. Historians very often have the limited view, I find, that they squeeze everything into a historic pattern. They call it variables. As long as they have enough variables, they can say it was this way in the Cuban crisis, and therefore, using our understanding of the Cuban crisis as an example, we will look into other crises and find a solution similarly. It somehow blocks, in a way, the singularity, the individuality, and the uniqueness of the new situation. And the real challenge of international relations is to find the newness, to adapt to the newness, and therefore you need to be innovative. History might help you in a certain way, but I would say in a very limited way. In looking for solutions, you always have to be aware of consequences. Solutions are made of options, different options. This, that, and the other. One way, the other way, or a third way, just to simplify matters. Options. But for every option you need an alternative. If I take this option, what alternative do I have? Why do I not take the alternative? Why do I take the option? Reasons in the direction of consequences. To think of consequence in international relations is extremely difficult. The future is uncertain. The future is made of uncertainty. And the elements to capture possible future events is rather rare or rather difficult to do, admittedly. But that's the situation any politician is in. The finality of this exercise to come to a decision or a non-decision, even that, is that you want to have it accepted by both the international community and the domestic community. The domestic public and the international community. That's how politics are made. So they are not made, and not only made, on ethical terms. They are not only made on legal terms, as a lawyer I wish it would be. It isn't. They are made somehow with the assurance or with the hope of finding the acceptance of the international community and the domestic public to be re-elected domestically and to find their continuous reputation in international affairs. You could also call it legitimacy, domestic as well as international. What situations am I thinking of? Not in a specific way, but in a structural way. They are to be defined as threat to basic values, finite in time for response, and high probability of military intervention. In other words, it's a very high level of threat and of danger that you are faced with, in which these reactions have to be done. Now we're getting, and there we'll be getting into practical policy making, as I've participated in. We're getting into the decision-making process in crises. How is a decision-making? How is a decision in international relations made? The first thing you have to know, and you know by now already, is Putnam's two-level game. In the 80s, domestic sphere of decision-making, even foreign affairs decision-making has a domestic basis. And the other one is the international level of decision-making and the repercussions in international level. What's the relationship between these foreign affairs issues nowadays? Today, the lines between foreign and home issues are blurred. Major external issues have a domestic footprint. Publics are much more alert to foreign issues that affect them. Naturally, political parties capitalize on this. Foreign countries attempt to play the public diplomacy. You have to be proactive as a decision maker on two levels, the domestic level and the international level. And on both levels, you must encompass, somehow wind up the media. They are the ones who carry your justification, your legitimacy into the larger field of the international community. Now, there are three levels of decision-making, the management of this foreign policy decision-making. The first one is the formal decision hierarchy and process. Actually, it's the constitutional structure determined by every country. Who makes what decision in what constitutional structure? Depends on the country. I'm not going into the details. I'm just saying it is determined by the constitution. Who is responsible for foreign affairs? We know in our countries who it is, but that might vary. The second level is the institutions included in decision-making. They are state inclusions. How's my time? Fine. They are state decision makers and they are non-state decision makers. We'll see how they interact. There is a formal process of decision making, and there's an informal networking process. Start off with the foreign ministry. It's very hierarchical bureaucracy. Those who have had some experience in it know and have suffered under it. What decisions are we talking about? They are decisions of different importance. There is one, those are vital for the home country's survival, and they are vital to the interest, just vital to the interest of the country, and the other are affecting the interests of a country. And according to this, and the other one, the last one, is advancing national interest. According to the importance of the decision to be made, it is a matter of the head of government or cabinet, head of the government or foreign minister, permanent secretary, or head of the department. In other words, decisions are made on the level, hierarchy, according to the importance of the decision. Into the decision-making policy, our decision-making policy carry a lot of elements that are put into it. One is the elements within the ministry, resources of embassies, own analysis, and so on. And the other one is outside influence, the media, think tanks, and so on. All those can have a chance in the decision-making of the foreign ministry as an example. And not to forget, most of all, and finally, the human factor. It's somewhere in the hands of the very person who makes the decision. And this human factor I've talked about is very important, more than the actual consequences of at times more than the actual consequences. The inputs into the foreign ministry can be categorized as follows. Embassies, intelligence agency. I have always, very often been asked, what's the relationship between embassies and intelligence? Or let's put it the other way. What importance do intelligence services have? Simple answer, 10%. Never more than 10%. Why? Because a decision maker would like to verify the source of information. And rarely do the services have or give away their sources of information. Most of the time they don't have it. Trust me. Then there are media, internet, and advisory groups, just as non-state actors. I'll come to the non-state actors. What other official actors are there? Are the ministries, National Security Council, if there is, Parliament. Now we're getting into the non-state actors. Who are the non-state actors? The participating in the informal process. They are part of what one calls the international affairs community, as part of civil society. Opposition parties, business representatives, media, NGOs, think tanks, public opinion in general. A word on the media. The media nowadays has an important power of knowledge gathering. It has the power of forging opinions and promoting opinions. But it also has something which I call the responsibility within civil society. The media in itself, national, international, is just part of international society and has to carry eventually the same responsibility, in as much as they are active in international relations, as all the other players. They often forget, and they are hardly aware. Now, the principles of responsible journalism, just as an example, journalism in a wider sense, in conflicts are, and I enunciate a few, not all are practiced, but I think what I'm telling you is a wish list of how they should act, media, in international relations. Avoid simplifying conflicts by presenting them as two-sided when many sides are involved. Cover the difference within these parties. Show that there are multiple goals involved, thus opening the scope of a range of outcomes. Number two, avoiding presenting conflict as a contest between good and evil. Remember, how often do we see in news media the good and the evil, the good and the bad? Give full coverage to peace initiatives. Explore how conflict can be transcended. Use precise language, avoiding emotive words, and demonizing labels. Difficult to do if the government who feeds into the media already gives you demonizing language. Nevertheless, the responsibility of the media should be, here I'm getting on uncharted territory obviously, to be more even-handed and less emotional. Feel more responsible for the media coverage and the analysis, political analysis that is added to it. Explore common ground and shared goals. We're far from it. We're rushing into the next media snippet rather than look for common ground and shared goals. Counter misconceptions, provide accurate information. These are some of the needs and advantages that the general public here and there are putting forward, and they will be pushed more and more. Watch out for it. The media has hardly seen its responsibility and certainly not lived up to its responsibility, but it will be drawn into it very soon. A word on the role of transnational companies. The transnational companies also have a role to play in crisis management, because peace and security is a part of the stability in which they work. Peace and security is the basis for their business. Stability has a peace dividend. This is true for all businesses, apart from the arms merchant. Well, all they need is insecurity rather than security. All the others need security. Therefore, what I'm putting forward to you here is an untapped potential of the business sector for corporate conflict prevention agendas. Now, all this is a matter of, according to the capabilities of and the political will of these companies. I'm talking about transnational biggest companies around. And it is a matter of the public expectation, and it's the matter of political pressure on them from international organizations, NGOs, and government. But it certainly feeds the logic of appropriateness, that it is expected of them to act in a peaceful manner within the context of crisis management. It shows the clear continuation of what you can see along all areas of activity in international relations. Power gives authority at best. Authority provides legitimacy, but legitimacy in all cases carries responsibility. 5 minutes, okay, good. Now, an example how the transnational companies are drawn into responsibility is the newest, the economic crisis. What do you hear, what do you read? That the association of, the International Banking Association is part of the solution, possible solutions, of the problem in Greece. The haircut is carried partly, and has to be responsibly agreed upon, by the International Banking Authority. Ackermann happens to be the president of it, the German head of the German bank. So there is a direct responsibility also in this non-military crisis, economic crisis, and they are drawn into it. It's not a matter among governments only. Right. Let me just see what I can best provide within the last 5 minutes. I'm not extending that. And I would call them points of reflection for creative diplomacy. And I repeat and summarize. One is the thinking about the other. To start every problem less with your own interest. What's my interest? What should I do? How can I defend myself? No. What's going in the mind of the other? Why does this happen? What's behind it? What's the intent? And then sooner or later you will come. With this knowledge, once you have it, you'll find your own reaction. The other, to understand the other system. It needs a different mindset. It needs a new mindset, because I know we all jump from problems to solution, to action, at best military action. In all countries, the role of individuals and leaders in decision-making remains powerful, but what has to be clarified is the human factor. Therefore, you have to use much more psychology than it has been done before. This is a reflection of public pressure and the general acceptance. Okay. Last point I would like to make is that at times it needs a strategic patience. Not all problems can be solved immediately at all times. The secret of diplomacy lies at times in strategic patience. It's the time factor which is behind it. Thank you. Wait until some problems can appear and resolve themselves. I will stop here.